Is China getting too fat for World War III? Until all war is fought by swarms of AI drones Zerg rushing each other, soldiers will still be one of the cornerstones of military supremacy. And as tensions rise along the Taiwan Strait and diplomacy gets frosty between China and the US of A, you might wonder whose soldiers would come out on top. Despite China's modernization efforts and what the CCP bot farms on Facebook might tell you, the US statistically takes the dub on all the vital metrics. But why? How has the country that gave us gunpowder and the art of war let its troops get so soft? That's what we're here to find out. From little emperors to the peace disease, here are all the strange and surprising reasons why your average PLA soldier is about as effective as the ones made of terracotta in the Lintong district. Our primary focus here won't be weapons and loadouts, where the US and Chinese soldiers are basically on par. As James Holmes of the Naval War College once said, the finest weapon is no better than its user. As you'll soon discover, one of the biggest problems facing the PLA today is that some of its finest weapons don't even have enough qualified users to operate them. That brings us to the first of the two prongs of Chinese troops' inferiority to their US counterparts. They're currently trying to organize their way out of a total recruitment meltdown. This is the kind of problem that goes so deep in the PLA, economically, culturally, and even physically, that it's going to take one hell of a leader to disentangle it all. And we have reason to believe President Xi Jinping is not up to the task. Let's start with the economic snafus. Regardless of what flag you wave, we know that deep down, it's all about the money, baby. An IISS report in 2023 estimated that the average salary of a Chinese soldier is a quarter of its US counterpart, making it a far less attractive prospect to enlist. From a budgeting perspective, you might argue that lower wages for soldiers is a sound tactical decision. China's military spending has always lagged behind that of the US, even though some figures in the geopolitical space, such as US Senator Dan Sullivan and US Army General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, believe that the actual PLA military budget is far higher than the $200 to $300 billion figure often circulated. Lower salaries help a budget stretch further, but this comes at the cost of diminishing the appeal of service, especially when you consider the kind of applicants the PLA is trying to court. The PLA is in the middle of sweeping modernization efforts across the board, from its technology to its strategy and operational structure. Still, we're seeing the rate of technological development outpace the qualifications of the soldiers who need to operate it. Jets and warships are gathering dust, while the PLA scrambles to entice new recruits who know what to do with them. The official PLA newspaper succinctly describes this phenomenon as equipment awaiting talent. And how do you entice talent with starvation wages? In the PLA's defense, efforts are ongoing to improve the dire salary situation. Major General Tang Yongsheng of the PLA's National Defense University said of the shortcomings in the PLA recruitment drives, "We need to do a lot more work, including changes to the recruitment system and making sure that people can develop after serving. Salaries can't be too low either." In response, the PLA recently raised the salary for college graduates enlisting as troops to 12,000 yuan, around $1,640, and a more impressive 72,800 yuan for NCOs. Given that the average income for university graduates in China is around 70,000 yuan, this is finally looking like a competitive price. Unless you work in tech, even more so if that tech is AI. Tech graduates generally earn double the average salary of other college graduates in China, and those specializing in AI are looking at quadruple. Suddenly, even the raised military salary looks like peanuts when these grads could be making bank in the private sector. This is a big problem for the PLA because these are the exact kinds of graduates they hope to poach. Military modernization puts a premium on soldiers with a background in STEM, but for most grads, that would mean not only taking a major pay cut, but losing freedoms as well. This probably should not be news to you, but the CCP's leadership style veers autocratic, and this trickles down to the PLA even more so than in civilian life. Soldiers are given heavy restrictions on both domestic and international travel, with particular issues arising around trips to Hong Kong. And if you're a Chinese soldier who feels like taking a vacation abroad when you're not on active duty, forget about it. Your family can go, but you must keep your feet planted firmly on Chinese soil, or a PLA and AF-owned warship. Even with higher salaries, if you can't go on vacation, service is starting to look more like a punishment than a noble call of duty. But hey, at least when you're at home, you can chill out with your family, maybe watch some movies, or surf the net. Haha, nope. The internet is already heavily restricted for average citizens in China, but if you're a career PLA soldier, you'll likely spend the better part of your life feeling like you're still living at your mom's house with a child lock on your web browser. Out of security concerns, or let's be real here, fears that soldiers will either see information that contradicts the healthy diet of party propaganda they're fed, soldiers will have their internet use heavily policed. This goes double for online self-expression. Soldiers aren't allowed to have blogs. So if you're a loyal PLA troop, but also have a passion for cooking or the outdoors and feel like writing pieces about your recipes or your hiking trips, you're out of luck, buddy. It's one of the central flaws of the current PLA doctrine that they favor party purity over merit in both recruitment and practice. Recruitment policies stress the importance of applicants having a clean political history, which isn't required for the U.S. Army. U.S. soldiers prize discipline. PLA soldiers prize obedience. And while obedience may help you do well internally, where politicking and butt-kissing are prized above all else, in a combat situation, the skilled combatant who can think on their feet and make on-the-fly decisions based on their operations awareness will always beat the soldier whose highest achievement is always doing what they're told. Educated and likely by extension independent and opinionated, people aren't lining up to have their speech suppressed by a party-poisoned military. Then again, when you hear the way a lot of PLA veterans talk about their time in the military, you start to understand why the CCP's propaganda machine isn't eager to let its soldiers speak their minds. According to China's Leadership Monitor, China has seen an uptick in protests from PLA veterans groups who have felt left out in the cold by the increasing absorption of PLA military leadership into the party under the power-hungry Xi Jinping. The United States could also stand to treat its veterans better, but the mistreatment of people who once served in the PLA is in a different league. In many cases, support structures are pitifully inept, and military benefits are left in the hands of local governments across the country rather than the central government. This has turned being a veteran into a kind of zip code lottery. With veterans out in the countryside, where the local governments are far less flush with CCP cash, getting as little as 400 yuan, or a measly $60 a month. These veterans have had extremely harsh words for their treatment. Perhaps the most inconvenient for Xi and his party is the assertion that veterans have been treated like donkeys slaughtered after they're too old to work a grindstone. This runs directly counter to the carefully manicured party narrative that veterans of the PLA are revered and well taken care of, when it seems that these people are discarded as soon as they outlive their usefulness. All these factors in the PLA seem like an extremely unattractive career path for the kind of talent they're seeking. Poor wages, a life of restriction, and a $60 check in the mail once a month for their trouble afterward. In the US, the Army does a far better job courting these highly qualified individuals, with a firm goal of recruiting 1/3 of college-educated individuals by 2028. It also seems that the US military has a more tangible and workable plan to achieve this too. Massive funding increases for recruitment and advertising for its higher tech career opportunities, complete with recruiters highly qualified in those subjects. Specifically, they're creating 2 new dedicated roles, a new warrant officer position and a new enlisted MOS 42T, which will focus entirely on targeted and data-driven talent acquisition. For those of you who have the skills the US needs, you won't need to go to them. They're likely to come to you. These departments have been exploring the recruitment possibilities in less typical epicenters for military recruitment and offering incredibly attractive enlistment bonuses of up to $50,000, more than your average PLA soldier would see from literally years of service. However, China's difficulty in mustering up top-tier talent for the PLA actually goes a lot deeper than its current policies. They're trying their best to pick out a better wallpaper pattern in a house that has black mold and a termite problem, because the degradation of the quality of the PLA soldiers also has its roots in far more deep-seated cultural issues than just bad salaries. Despite the fact that the PLA needs educated, qualified people more than ever to make their modernization plan more than buying billions of dollars worth of huge, shiny paperweights, the cultural perception in China is largely that being a soldier is a kind of a hick job. An old Chinese proverb goes, "All trades and occupations are inferior, and only studying is superior." Another proverb, "Good steel does not become nails," also warns against the life of a soldier. Even Confucian philosophy, which is foundational for a lot of modern Chinese philosophical thought, saw war as a lower vocation. This so-called scholar culture is completely at odds with the PLA's intention of putting together an army of highly educated troops and the earlier salary issues we were discussing only further contribute to the idea that the military is a job you only take if you have no other options. But it isn't just the private sector in China that's poaching the kinds of people the PLA would love to count among their numbers. It's the private sector abroad. The US, for example, has even better private sector pay than China. On average, even a trucker, one of the classic blue-collar jobs, will make 5 times in the US what they would in China. Couple that with the fact that educated people tend to be more independent and free-thinking, traits that, to point the obvious out, don't exactly have a premium in an autocracy, you start to see the phenomenon of brain drain emerge. In other words, China's migration statistics are in the net negative. They're losing more people to other countries than they're gaining. And the people they're losing tend to be the exact kinds of people that they want flying their jets, manning their high-tech warships, and helping them develop sophisticated military AI programs. As is often the case, China's loss is America's gain here, much to the frustration of Xi Jinping. Despite its propaganda, China is also just as susceptible to a trend we've seen sweeping the rest of the world. Gen Z just aren't as interested in enlisting. A social phenomenon popped up in early 2020 known as Tang Ping, or lie flat. While not specifically about the military, Tang Ping served as a general societal protest from the youth about the expectations placed on them by a society that demands overwork and overachieving. China's Gen Z aren't feeling driven to seek the same fast-paced lives of many of their ancestors, and becoming a part of the party machine by way of the PLA is the last thing they want to do. Naturally, the CCP clamped down hard on the Tang Ping movement, only furthering the need for its very existence in the first place and further alienating them from the younger generations they so desperately needed to join the PLA. When it comes to the problems suffered by the soldiers in the PLA, you can often find the cause by looking back at questionable policies of the CCP's past. One infamous piece of legislation that's had an absolutely ruinous effect on the soldiers of China is the one-child policy, which ran from 1979 to 2015 in hopes of curbing rampant overpopulation in the country. This has resulted in what experts have called the Little Emperor phenomenon. We're looking at multiple generations of only children, far more coddled by their parents in a way that's likely made them significantly less tough than the soldiers coming from large families of generations past. Families are also less likely to approve of their one and only child shipping off to war, especially in our current era of heightened military tensions. China has seen the same hit taken to military families, meaning that these families are getting smaller and their military traditions are closer to being phased out. Obviously, this is no bueno for the state of China's soldiers. There aren't as many of them, and the ones that are there are total mama's boys. However, the problem goes deeper than temperament. A lot of people in the prime generation for military enlistment may not even meet the physical and mental requirements to make the cut. Over 50% of Chinese adults are overweight or obese, a disqualifying factor for military service. Like most places in the developed world, this uptick of obesity is likely a result of a sedentary lifestyle, encouraged by long office working hours and the consumption of a lot of cheap processed fast food. Again, as a result of having little free time outside of work to cook proper meals. But it isn't just a problem with body weight, it also extends to general physical aptitude. In a recent study at a prominent university in China, 60% of people tested in a sample study couldn't pass a basic physical exam. Given that this test was taken at a university, i.e. the place where the educated people that the PLA wants to poach are, it shows a grim prospect for the PLA. Even if qualified people with degrees in tech do have an interest in military work, they might not pass the physical. Another big setback for the PLA, even if their recruits pass the physical, is that basic training is revealing cracks, both in the systems at play and in the literal bones of their troops. That's right, internal reporting from the PLA has shown that Chinese recruits are suffering a greater number of stress fractures in basic training. For those lucky enough to have never experienced a stress fracture firsthand, stress fractures are tiny but extremely painful cracks that can appear in the bone after strenuous repetitive motion. Anyone can get them, but you have a greater chance if you're overweight or have poor form in conducting certain exercises. It doesn't bode well for the prospects of Chinese soldiers if basic training is wrecking them to such an extent. The US military has already developed a countermeasure for this. One program for this very purpose is the Future Soldier Preparatory Course, which is a multi-week course that essentially trains future applicants in a way that makes them get more out of future training, both physically and academically. To their credit, the U.S. Army has historically been extremely flexible and light on its feet with adjusting to societal and demographic changes. The same cannot be said for the PLA. An April 2022 Chinese defense paper put it far more bluntly than we ever could, saying, "Young recruits don't know what they'll do after enlisting. Military authorities don't know what units need, and units don't know what new recruits can do. Yikes." But it's more than just physical health and aptitude and fitness. Being a soldier is an extremely mentally taxing job. You're liable to find yourself in some of the most stressful and high-pressure situations in the world. In other words, you ideally will be just as mentally honed as you are physically. Sadly for the PLA, this doesn't appear to be the case for their soldiers. A whopping 25 to 30% of PLA members report suffering from psychological problems. Particularly affected were soldiers in the missile force, who spend a lot of time isolated underground in missile silos. You have to ask yourself, if you're a financially mobile tech graduate from Beijing's elite Tsinghua University, would you rather be going mad in a missile silo for a meager PLA salary or soaking up the sun and venture capital investments while piloting a startup in Silicon Valley? Seems kinda like a no-brainer, doesn't it? The only kind of people who would end up with these jobs looking at it from this framework are suckers who don't know any better. This explains why, despite granting around 8,000 degrees a year, Tsinghua has reported only around 16 graduates joining the PLA every year since 2006. Recently, it's gone as low as 12. That equals a lot of equipment that's still very much waiting for its talent. And making all this even worse is that the turnover from these high-priority recruits is appalling, even when the PLA manages to get them. One incentive structure put in place to help attract these applicants was a guarantee of a good state sector job after they served a preordained amount of time in the military. The problem was that most of these candidates would only stick around for the absolute minimum time needed to qualify for that cushy state job for which they were promised preferential treatment. In the words of Ken Allen, a former American Air Force officer who studies PLA personnel issues, there are more incentives to leave the PLA than to remain in it. Retention issues like this don't even affect high-priority candidates. We can see problems in Chinese soldiers all the way down to the rank and file. In 2020, of the 400,000 recruits who volunteered to be enlisted, there was a reported uptick in troops that outright refused to actively serve when called for, despite the risk of harsh penalties. What good is the PLA having all the soldiers in the world if, when push comes to shove, they won't actually do any fighting? In late 2022, PLA soldiers reported an increase in feelings of nervousness, anxiety, and fearful emotions as tensions rose with India and combat exercises suddenly ramped up. The print, when observing these heightened combat exercises, saw a shocking lack of preparedness for the scenarios they were facing. In their words, "We noticed that the Chinese soldiers were in constant need of medical evacuation and care while being posted at high altitudes and extreme cold, which was a first for them. In our assessment, the Chinese were forced to do a faster rotation of troops because the soldiers could not stand long deployment in such extreme conditions. When it comes to the heat of combat, PLA soldiers don't appear to be equipped to enter the kitchen. Everything so far has been an exploration of why China can't seem to get the best of the best to steer its modernizing military in the right direction. But what about the soldiers they've already got in the bag? What makes them so horrifically unprepared compared to the soldiers the US Army has to offer? Well, first and foremost, it's because the PLA and the CCP above it are shockingly corrupt. This is hardly new. Back in the 1990s, when the PLA was undergoing its first modernization push after the collapse of the Soviet Union, bribes were passed around like party favors. Poor families bribed PLA officials to get their children enlisted, and rich families did the opposite, bribing officials to keep them out of the army. There were stories at the time of corruption being so rampant that luxury cars like Jaguars and Porsches were seen driven around with official PLA license plates. The people involved were certainly getting richer, but were the soldiers getting better? Hell to the no. From 2013 to 2015, a mere 2-year period, PLA Daily announced that the government had investigated, quote, 4,024 officers with the rank of lieutenant colonel or above, including 82 generals, for corruption concerns resulting in 21 removals, 144 demotions, and 77 reprimands. What kind of crimes are they committing, you ask? These duty crimes consisted of bribes to pay for promotions and rise through the PLA ranks, as well as improperly involving military construction, oil management, material and armament procurement, healthcare, real estate, and reception services. It's a hell of a roster for a military trying to reach parity with the United States. The corruption is hitting the PLA where it hurts, specifically their prized rocket force. Described by Tom Shugart, a former U.S. Navy officer who is now an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security think tank, as the center of gravity for the Chinese military, specifically within the context of a Taiwanese invasion, where the rocket force would, in theory, come in clutch at dominating U.S. warships in the region. However, the rocket force is seemingly plagued by a Three Stooges level of farcical corruption, and it's turning what could have been the PLA's trump card into just another joker. According to internal investigations, some missiles were found to be filled with water rather than fuel. The idea of soldiers and officers selling off the fuel to make a profit is one thing, but in some cases it gets even stupider. One person was accused of siphoning rocket fuel to cook hot pot. Improperly functioning silo lids, severe enough to completely derail a potential launch, were also left completely unaddressed. It got so severe that Xi Jinping had to institute sweeping measures to root out the corruption in the rocket force, purging over a dozen senior officials in a 6-month period. We don't know how deep this mess goes in the rocket force, but it doesn't paint a picture of competent, trustworthy soldiers ready for engagement with the U.S. forces. Of course, Xi is trying his best to scorch the earth on corrupt officials and soldiers undermining the progress of the PLA, but the success is mixed, and the whole situation is a bad look for the CCP and the Chinese military. In addition to the rocket force corruption purges, Xi has ousted a former Air Force chief, a Navy commander overseeing actions in the South China Sea, and several officers responsible for equipment management. That'd be the equipment that's very patiently waiting on talent, by the way. Cutting out the cancer of military corruption is a full-time job for Xi in and of itself. Alfred Wu, associate professor at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore, said in late 2023, "More heads will roll. The purge that centered around the rocket force is not over." Knowing the cruelty Xi is capable of, the many corrupt officers still embedded in the PLA have to be hoping that more heads will roll is just a metaphor. That being said, this is still a devastating setback for the PLA on the whole, perhaps best summed up by Chen Daoyin, formerly an associate professor at Shanghai University of Political Science and Law, who said that while Xi drank the Kool-Aid on his own military strength, corruption is giving him a stark look at the reality of the army he is spearheading. Chen said, "How can the generals' hearts be in fighting if they're just busy lining their own pockets?" Xi now knows that their proclamations of loyalty to the party and to the military ring hollow. I imagine this would zap his confidence somewhat. It's also zapping our confidence in the PLA soldiers. After all, if this corruption has laid anything bare, it's the fact that this military is not a meritocracy. The prevalence of bribes and cronyism makes its upper echelons feel more like a mafia family than a functioning army. And this trickles down. Despite his purges, Xi is not immune to his own forms of corruption. For example, he ousted officers loyal to former leaders and vocal opponents of his planned invasion of Taiwan. He even sentenced former Air Force General Liu Yashao to death for his anti-war positions while stacking the upper rungs of PLA with toadying loyalists, once again choosing obedience over aptitude. Of course, no discussion of major flaws of PLA soldiers is complete without exploring the peace disease, a pithy and incredibly dystopian turn of phrase from President Xi that describes the PLA's lack of real military experience. This lack of experience is generally one of the key deciding factors in whether a military force is a paper tiger or a face-eating 500-pound Bengal. Xi and other PLA power players have made no secret of their fear that the PLA isn't ready for the intensity of modern combat, and as such may crumple under pressure when the shooting starts. Like most strongman autocracies, China never gives up an opportunity to posture its supposed military might. But underneath that bluster is the subtle fear that the PLA in a real mass combat scenario may have all the staying power of cotton candy in a shallow puddle. One of the United States military's greatest advantages is not only having a vast wealth of military experience, but also internalizing lessons from real combat scenarios that they can use to build more realistic training scenarios from the bottom up. This, by the way, is another huge problem for the PLA, but we'll get to that later. If China does indeed have a peace disease, then the US has a war disease, which is a bad thing in most cases, but it gives them huge advantages in this arena. Since 1941, the US Army has been able to hone its skills in World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Panama, Grenada, the First Gulf War, Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan, not to mention global peacekeeping, assisted regime changes, and anti-terror initiatives that have made both conventional and unconventional warfare intimately familiar territory. Even in cases that are widely looked at as failures for the US, like the Vietnam War, they have been invaluable teachers, thanks to the US military's analytical learning process. In short, compared to the sheltered forces of the PLA, it's damn near impossible to throw something at American soldiers that they or their brothers in arms haven't seen before. This gives them a leg up for both operational and strategic knowledge tailored to the needs of thoroughly modern warfare. Compared to this, the PLA approach of still entertaining Maoist asymmetric combat doctrine like the human wave feels laughable in its inapplicability to modern combat compared to the far simpler, if more bloody and primitive, era of China's Red Army glory days. The last real war that China was involved in was the month-long Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979, which was accented by mostly small skirmishes here and there. Because of all of this, a shocking proportion of China's top military leaders are armchair generals who have never seen actual combat. Lieutenant General He Lai, who once led a PLA regional command and was deputy head of the Academy of Military Science, said in a 2023 interview with The Economist, "I've been a soldier for more than 50 years, and I've never been to war. But we can't go to war to increase our combat experience, right?" If coining peace disease wasn't enough, Xi Jinping himself has given some of the most brutal criticisms of the state of the PLA, its commanders, and its soldiers, lumped under the umbrella terms the 2 inabilities and the 5 incapables. Because lumping it together into the 7 inabilities somehow feels even more humiliating. These are what Xi categorized as the greatest obstacles to his stated goal of reaching military modernization by 2035 and becoming a world-class military by 2049, the centennial of the communist takeover of China. The 2 inabilities are the PLA's inability to fight a modern war and its officers' inability to command. The 5 incapables refers to Xi's criticisms that some commanders are unable to properly judge situations, understand the intent of their superiors, deploy troops, make operational calls, and deal with the unexpected. This list kinda makes you wonder what Xi even thinks the PLA can do. In 2018, the PLA Daily echoed Xi's sentiments and went on the warpath against the weaker members of the PLA, accusing them of neglecting their combat training and being too weak or incompetent to fight. And given everything we've seen here, it's hard not to take the PLA Daily at its word for once on this particular issue. Because the PLA soldiers and officers lack discipline and cohesion, that same lack of cohesion has traveled upwards, manifesting in a chronic inability to successfully conduct joint operations between military branches. In this area, US soldiers and command structures easily run circles around them. Today, the exemplary case of a PLA joint operation is the amphibious landing to capture Yijiangshan Island from Kuomintang forces, which occurred in, drumroll please, 1955, when Chairman Mao was still in power. Having a party-controlled military, with the PLA reporting to the CCP's Central Military Commission and political officers second-guessing the work of military commanders, on top of this, dooms the PLA to be mired in the petty political aspirations of the CCP, holding it back from reaching its full potential. This contradicts the US's adherence to unity of command and makes the PLA a slower and unwieldier beast than the US Army could ever be. Of course, maybe some of this could be redeemed by one factor: if the PLA had world-class realistic training that helped compensate for its lack of combat experience. But you've already seen the title of this video, so you know that the Chinese soldiers aren't going to redeem themselves here. In fact, Chinese training has often been described as some of the least realistic and applicable of any major player on the world stage. Like with most areas of the Chinese government, training is bogged down by dogmatic propaganda from the CCP, encouraging the soldiers of the PLA to internalize functionally useless information that props up the narrative of the party. Many from both inside and outside of China have criticized the formalism of PLA training methods, arguing that the methods used are more for ornamentation than actual pragmatic use. Despite its efforts to improve here, the PLA has admitted that there is, as quoted, a large gap between the PLA's level of training and the requirements of actual combat. Cheating is also rife, undermining the value of even the more useful exercises and placing more doubt on the competency of every PLA soldier in service. In the last few years, changes have been made to make the red-blue training scenarios more reflective of the inherent unpredictability of war, and the addition of night operations and adding multi-surface concurrent objectives to training operations is a positive sign. If the PLA can implement a more realistic and practical training system, they may be in there with a chance. But even this might take an additional generation of soldiers before it starts paying dividends in any noticeable way. All this raises the question, what happens when Chinese soldiers end up in an actual combat situation outside the heavily controlled circumstances of PLA training? To explore one particularly upsetting example, you don't need to look any further than an incident that occurred in Sudan in 2016 during a violent civil war between the country's president, Salva Kiir, and his rival, Riek Machar. Chinese soldiers working as UN peacekeepers were meant to be protecting refugee camps and, well, keeping the peace for the sake of civilians in embattled South Sudan. But they largely remained at the fortified bases in order to avoid potentially putting themselves in danger. This would be poor form all on its own. Still, when militants began attacking the fortified bases, killing 2 of the Chinese peacekeepers in an artillery strike, the remaining ones abandoned their posts, leaving their equipment, guns, and ammunition. At the same time, a large number of civilians and Kiir's forces were slaughtered. This drew understandably heavy criticism from human rights groups like the US-based Center for Civilians in Combat, and also cast serious doubt on whether these Chinese soldiers could even be considered competent. It goes without saying that the Sudanese insurgents' power isn't even close to what the US military is capable of. It's hard not to speculate that in a hypothetical skirmish against US soldiers, PLA troops might once again fold under the pressure. All of the above has had an understandably acidic effect on the morale of PLA soldiers. Their contrived command structures and corrupt superiors leave them adrift, and their poor salaries, lack of tangible experience, and largely unrealistic training scenarios leave them as a poor foe for the superior soldiers of the US military. Oh well, at least there's always nukes. Now check out China versus the United States. Who will win World War III? Military-army comparison. Or watch this instead.